All right, so first thing I want to mention is this course was redone from previous classes. So the way we're addressing things is we're going to try to get through some of the basic concepts initially, and then we'll come back and revisit each religion in the second half of the semester to try and get more in depth into the ideas after you've had the time to process, to start thinking, and to really learn some of the key basic concepts. Now, for most of the religions, this is going to work wonderfully. For tribal religions, it actually poses just an additional level of a challenge because indigenous religions don't all have the same beliefs. Even within a single tradition, say the eastern band of the Cherokee versus the western band of the Cherokee, or you look at how voodoo is practiced in Haiti compared to in New Orleans, there are differences. There are differences in beliefs. There are differences in practices. So when we have a section that's called Tribal Religions in Tribal Africa, it's a misnomer because we can't really say that there's one belief, one concept, one type of practice. Which means there are very few key terms that are broad enough that we need to make sure everybody knows the key terms. There are a few things, though, that I do want to make sure you understand, and we'll go through some of that today. If we get through that part today, then in class we will watch a video on the Gagaju, a tribal group out of northwestern Australia, the region of Kakadu. Even if we do start watching that video in class, you will need to watch the rest of it on your own at home. You will not be able to watch the whole thing. Because we look at tribal America, because we look at tribal Africa, we want one group that we're able to try and look through those questions of ultimate concern. What are the beliefs about the ultimate power, the ideas of creation, the ideas of what happens after we die? One group where we can say, well, what are some of their rituals? How do they practice? What are their daily activities, or monthly or yearly? And how they address the social, from what are the places they go to worship, or how have they interacted. And so by having one primary group that we focus on, we'll also be able to address some of these questions from other perspectives. So to get started, a couple of dates that you need to know. In regards to dates, most of you are familiar with the phrase AD and BC. BC standing for before Christ, and AD standing for after God, or after his death. Couple problems with using that system for dating. One, it's not politically correct. That's just ages. A better understanding is the fact that our calendar actually does not match up with those dates, because the fact is the exact year is not known, and the calendar was reformulated at least 2 to 3 different times, with different dates being the date when time was fixed to a particular year. This also changed the dates. So the figure Jesus was probably born somewhere between about 4 and 8 BCE. Well, that would change the year. Rather than trying to figure out all those notions and still be politically correct in the sense of trying to see modern time as something separate from one religious perspective, we use the phrase BCE, before the Common Era, and CE, the Common Era. So this is the calendar, the system we're familiar with, where right now we're in 2019. When we look historically, we can see that prior to about 8,000 BCE, groups tended to have traits that we call primal. So examples of primal traits include this is the time period of hunters and gatherers. Right? If you're hunters, if you're gatherers, do you stay in one place? No. So you're nomadic. If you're nomadic, are you going to be able to have a very large community of people, or do you think it's going to be a smaller population? Smaller population. Do you think you're going to have the time to create a whole lot of lifespan rituals, or do you think there's just going to be maybe 5 to 10 main rituals that go through the lifespan? There's only going to be that 5 to 10. There's going to be a shorter number of lifespan rituals because you're constantly moving. You don't have the time to really develop all of these different rituals. There will be rituals for birth. There will be around 3 to 4 years of age. There will be rituals usually for marriage of some form. There will be rituals at death, and maybe a couple others. That is about it. Now, around 8000 BCE, a change occurs. Before we state that change, let's talk about what comes after. It's known as the Archaic time period. Now, people have started to be more sedentary. Well, they had to be nomadic because they were hunters and gatherers. That they're sedentary means what? What has developed?
Community.
What else? They had to be nomadic because they were hunters and gatherers. Now they're able to be sedentary because now they're agriculture. They're farming. They have agriculture. Now that they're staying in one place, now that they have agriculture that is more reliable, they can have a larger population. With that larger population, you're going to have more developed skill sets. There's going to begin to be almost like a class or a hierarchy system based on individual skills. Where in the primal, almost everyone had to know everything. There were some discipline areas, but there was more of a sense of being egalitarian. Does anybody know what that means?
Women and men are both equal.
Right. We're on an even footing. We might have slightly different strengths and weaknesses, but every single member is essential to the success of the community. So the change around 8000 BCE is the agricultural revolution. Archaeologists continue to debate this date because there are some communities around the world where it appears that they may have started agriculture as early as about 10 to 15,000 BC. And the fact is there are still nomadic tribes today, trying to exist as nomadic tribes today, that still do not have really developed farming agriculture because they are nomadic. But it seems to be around 8000 BCE when parts of China, India, Indonesia, parts of Europe, parts of the Americas begin to see the development of an established agriculture, farming communities. Now, anything before 8000 BCE, primal. From 8000 to 3000 is archaic. From 3000 to roughly 1000 is called historic. The historic time period is marked by much larger communities. We're talking large-scale civilizations. You can think ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, ancient Greece, ancient China, these time periods when there were massive empires forming. There's a true hierarchy to society. There's usually a class or a caste system of some kind that's been developed. They have large-scale agriculture. They also have large-scale trading. You see, during the archaic time period, you still might have hunting parties that might go out for 2-3 weeks. But as you get to the historic, your community is trading with other groups that aren't quite at the same level to get things. So trade and economy. Now, there's one other set of years I want you to know. And in the textbook, there's almost an emphasis or a move to make it a much longer time period in order to make sure we see Christianity and Islam included. But the original writer, the person who developed this notion of the axial age, Karl Jaspers, specifically said the time period was from 800 BCE to 200 BCE, a 600-year time period. And what he noticed is that during this time period, you have this huge growth of religiosity, of philosophy, of seeking to have a better sense of the philosophical sides of debate to discuss things. He also saw it as a time period where, religiously speaking, these major religions that had formed or began to form started to culminate in what their key ideas would be. So, for instance, from philosophy, you have the time period of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Bridging from philosophy to religion is the time period of Confucius and Lao Tzu. The time period of both Siddhartha, the time period of Mahavira, so Buddhism, Jainism. It's a time period of the Upanishads in Hinduism where there was this focus on core ideas, key terms. It's a time period of the Babylonian exile, the writings of Isaiah and Ezekiel in Judaism. This attempt to redefine what it meant to be Jewish after the time period of exile. So there's a focus on the priests and a focus on the laws, the religion, the philosophy, the morals. It also, in order to move towards that notion that, again, in your textbook, it stresses or begins to stretch the notion of the axial age going up into the Common Era, you do have the beginning of a Messianic era. And you have the growth of Zoroastrianism. And those two components are key to understanding the development of Christianity and the development of Judaism. So while development of Islam. While Islam does not have an active event during this time period, and while Christianity hasn't yet developed in this time period, the precursors or the associated events are occurring. So these are just a few time periods that I want you to know as we move through. When it relates to tribal religions, we have to understand tribal religions are going to be all of these time periods. The Gagaju of Australia date back somewhere between 40 and 60,000 years. They are essentially one of the oldest, longest surviving groups in the, well, not really surviving anymore, but longest survived groups where the evidence is that they were the people in that region of Kakadu in Australia for that entire time period. In other regions, we might see and find these communities that may have existed 40,000 years ago, but often we see that other groups came in, mixed, and new groups, and there's constant change. The Gagaju really had the region to themselves up until less than 200 years ago. In fact, it's on this day, back in the 1800s, when British colonialists first went to New Zealand. It really wasn't that much time before that they had went to Australia. So much of the indigenous people of Australia, unlike tribal Africa, unlike tribal America, really were able to retain their beliefs without a lot of outside influence up until 150, 200 years ago. But tribal religions do still exist today. They exist in Africa, they exist in the US, in Canada, in Mexico, in Peru, in places all over this world. Indigenous groups that have traits going back to the primal time period. There are still nomadic hunters and gatherers. There are still groups that have many of the traits associated with archaic culture. So to understand this view, we need to look at some of the things about indigenous groups, because we can have some generalizations. They tend to be more cosmological than transcendental. What does cosmological mean? Who remembers?
The power is down here on her.
The ultimate power is part of this world. We can see, we can go. In regards to the Gagaju, whether you watch the video in class or started today in class or you just watch on your own, you will hear the elders say, that rock there, that rock is in Juanjua. It is the creator being. Now at the same time, almost all indigenous tribal groups around the world also have transcendental traits. And that transcendental aspect has only increased over the last 100 years. So again, the Gagaju, dream time, which used to be the same as secular time or our time, is now separate. Dream time has faded. It's moved further away. So there's another realm. Wankantanka is all the spirits, it is all existence, but it's also somewhat separate or beyond this world. So there are transcendental traits. Each individual tribe has to be seen as just that, individual tribe, where how cosmological or how transcendental it is, where it is on that line is going to vary. But generally speaking, tribal groups are more cosmological than our major world religions. Now, they tend to be observation-based. That sounds pretty simple just to say it, but what does it really mean? So, if we think prior to 3000 BCE, prior to all of our technology and knowledge at our fingertips, what do we observe when we look around us? What do we start noticing?
Change in weather, animals, the different seasons.
All right, so we notice there are seasons, and with these seasons, there's changes in the weather patterns. There's changing in the animals and how they behave, where they go, where they roam, what they're doing. There's changes in the placement of the sun in the sky.
There's changes in the plants.
Plants, the trees. The placement of the sun and the moon. Now, what do they notice about these changes? What ends up happening? They start seeing that there's a
Life pattern.
There's a pattern, and what shape does that pattern take? It's a circle. They see that these patterns are cyclical. The seasons come in cycles. It's technically winter right now. Soon it will be spring, then it will be summer, and then it will be fall. Sure enough, winter's going to come back again. Everything they notice tends to be cyclical. There's a quote, everything that birds do is made, all the homes of birds are made in a circle, and therefore we make our community in a circle. Because of how they see the birds doing, but also how they notice everything is cyclical. There's cycles of weather patterns, plants, animals, trees, and then there's these big cycles, the sun and the moon. Groups might have more of a lunar or a solar calendar dependent on the placement or the importance of the sun or the moon. So if we think about the moon, they notice that there's roughly a 28 to 29 day cycle of the moon. They would have noticed that women's cycles actually matched up with the cycle of the moon historically, prior to modern culture. Even just if you go out in rural areas, there tends to still be a better connection than there is in the cities when it comes to women's cycles and the lunar cycle. They notice that the waters get agitated during the full moon. In fact, interestingly, there's even a name given to the full moon that we just recently had that's based on Native American spirituality. Anybody know the name of the full moon we just had? It was a blood moon, but it's not just blood. Super wolf blood moon. Reason being, when this moon appeared, it always signaled that the wolves would be out and crying and howling at the moon. So there, and there's a little bit longer story, but I'm not going to go on that big of a tangent right now. But there was a background to understanding these lunar events. All right, solar events. So what happens in and around the 20th, 21st of June, and what happens around the 20th, 21st of December? No, solstices. Summer solstice, winter solstice. Summer solstice in the northern hemisphere is the longest. What? Summer solstice, northern hemisphere is the longest day and the shortest night. Winter solstice in the northern hemisphere is the longest night and shortest day. Between those points, you have the equinoxes. Now, you have 4 main points. There also happen to be 4 points between each of those, which is said to be when you know the seasons are changing. The points in between also tend to be harvest times. Almost every religion, from tribal religions up to our major world religions, will have holy days, usually within 1 week, week and a half of those 8 days throughout the year. Some will be more in agreement, some will be a little less in agreement. But these time periods of change, of seeing where the sun is, where the moon is, where we are at our seasons, tend to be important time periods that we mark in our lives. Even in secular society, we still use these types of dates in determining things. Now, being cyclical, they also tend to be non-apocalyptic or non-eschatological. What does that mean? Did anyone read in their textbook anything about an end times story? Not really. There isn't really the belief in an end of the world. Not in the sense that we hear about it from other religions that tend to have a lot of beliefs about apocalyptic events or a belief towards the eschatological, the end times. And no, the Mayans never predicted the end of the world in 2012. They never did that. In fact, they don't predict an end to their calendar at all. Some of the predictions in their calendar go up to the year 4000 and beyond. However, 2012 did mark an end of a cycle that was thousands of years long. And the ends and beginnings of cycles are important. The bigger the cycle, the more importance it is. So as we begin each month, we might say, okay, what I didn't get done in January, I'm going to get done in February. We even might have shorter ones. Well, I didn't do it yesterday, I'll do it today. That's not as important. But when we think about the yearly cycle is more important. Because as we're approaching the end of the year, what does Facebook make sure we remember? Everything we did this past year. And so that's what we do. We reflect on what's happened. And we're either thankful the year is over or going to miss some of the great times and just hoping that we continue to have them. And sure enough, as the new year comes, we have this revived vigor and hope and sense that this year is going to be better. and we set out all these resolutions. You might do the same thing when your birthday comes around. As you approach your birthday, you start thinking. With a sense of cyclical time, when changes begin and end in these cycles, when they restart over, it's always a time to see what's new. It's always a time of addressing what's happened and having a new attitude. So when you had groups that were taking this end of the world Mayan calendar 2012, it wasn't the end of the world, it was the end of a cycle and the beginning of a new cycle. And so with those ideas of a new cycle was that idea that this would bring change, spirituality, etc. We see those changes though, we see that desire for changes every time cycles begin. Now, with these cycles, they're looking at the animals, they're looking at the plants. Some groups will focus on how when you die, you go to another realm of existence, heavens. Some will say you return to the earth. Some will say that you become part of the Great Spirit. Some might even say you are born again. You're reborn almost in the sense of reincarnation. Because they see that, well, it certainly looks like the apple tree died in the winter, but sure enough, in the spring, there's buds, there's leaves again. The basil that looks like it's completely gone, sure enough, it sprouts up again. So tribal religions tend to be this way because of what they're observing, what they're seeing with the cycles. Well, as such, the rituals, the myths are tied to the cycles. If you read a story about Mother Corn or the goddess Corn, it most likely comes from an archaic time period. There's agriculture. Stories are going to be tied to, rituals will be tied to what they are doing. Does it mean that they worship that animal? No. One thing, and I don't know if I specified it clearly when we were talking about classifications of religion, just because you have a religion or a group that is animistic, it doesn't mean they worship animals. It means that they're getting answers to questions of ultimate concern from animals. Some groups might worship an animal, but it doesn't mean they're worshiping it just because we use the phrase animal. The totems that are on the totem pole, they're archetypes. They're ideals, they're symbols. They're not necessarily what's worshipped. There is that slight difference. So for instance, when they're doing the wild chicken dance, it's in order to act like the wild chicken. To draw it close, to try to bring about the spirit, the energy of the wild chicken so that they will have a successful hunt. It's not because they're worshiping the salmon. But the rituals, the myths are tied to what they see in nature. They're tied to observing the cycles. The Gagaju will burn the fields every year. But they have to burn it according to the cycles, which means you can only burn it during the time of migrating birds. Because you need to make sure the baby birds are big enough to be able to fly and leave the fires. But you also have to make sure that the ground is still damp enough so that the fires won't burn out of control. When this is done, you cleanse the land. You do not destroy it. Interesting thing, since the Aboriginal government and many of these tribes in Kakadu have began to completely die off and the annual traditions of burning the grasslands has been removed, when there are fires now, they're much worse and much more destructive. There actually was, we could say, a science behind these rituals they were doing because they observed these cycles. They knew when, they knew how to do things. There is an inherent connection to nature. And humans do not transcend it. Now, In primal time period, you might have stories where humans and animals are the same. We're on the same level. As you move to archaic, you begin to see that humans are slightly above animals, plants, and nature, but we're supposed to echo nature still. There's still a harmony between the two. It's only when we move towards the historic that we see that mankind has become elevated way above the natural world. Not just so that they can now control it, but they truly transcend it in a philosophical way, in a spiritual way, which results in a different attitude towards nature. It results in a different attitude towards plants and towards animals. So when is there worship? Well, it depends. We have to figure out what we mean by worship and how we define it. Is what is taking place, is it worship? Is it reverence? Is it honoring? If you had a clan that was known as the Deer Clan, that deer clan might create a totem of a deer. They might make offerings to this deer. The outsider might look and say, this appears to be worship. But then, upon further investigation, they learned that no, this is not worship. They are just honoring the spirit of all deer so that the deer will continue to thrive. Because they also happen to be the only group of people that's also allowed to kill the deer, would be the deer. Because they know how many they can kill. They know which ones to kill, which ones they've observed them closely enough to know which deer have families they need to take care of, and which deer do not have families. Once man becomes elevated above nature, that observation tends to decline. Are there exceptions? Yes. But it tends to decline. Religion and society are one. There isn't any secularization or separation. Everything you do is connected to your belief in spirit. Everything you do, you know that you are engaging with Wellington Tonka. Everything you do, you know that it is in some way connected to the dreamer. As these tribal groups begin to have more transcendental traits, though, we do begin to see a separation. Secular life compared to sacred life. We'll come back and address this question of secular and sacred after the video when I ask you about why one of the gentlemen, Jonathan Yaramara, why he is not allowed to be a fully initiated elder. Now, because you don't quite know what I'm talking about yet, I'm going to go ahead and give you another example. There's an Onondagan man. And Warren Leone, you can actually look him up. He is a Native American activist. But he told a story years ago to a religious scholar, Houston Smith, about what had happened when he left college and went home. He graduated from college. Wise, smart, has his degree, and he goes home to his people, the Onondagans. And his uncle takes him out in the canoe. His uncle says, "Who are you?" "I'm Warren Leone." "No, who are you?" "I'm your nephew." "Who are you?" "I'm an Onondagan man." "Who are you?" Kept going on and on until Warren was completely lost at what his uncle was trying to do. He was answering everything he knew. He was young, his age, his date of birth, his parents, all these different things. Finally, his uncle said, "See that bluff over there on the side of the lake? Warren, you are that bluff. See the tree, the willow, with its branches stretching out to the sky and its other branches stretching out towards the water and the ground? You are that tree. Warren, feel the water that supports this canoe. You are the water." There's a Seneca? No, she wasn't Seneca. There used to be an elder lived up off of Bears Avenue here in Tampa. And she told a similar story about how once you're educated, you no longer see the magic as simply. A separation begins to build between what is special, what is sacred, and what is secular. Once you know everything it's made of, it's harder to see the mystery of the event. And so in tribal religion, sometimes some groups have sought to maintain their identity so they don't lose that inherent connection. Most of the times these groups have eventually died off, but they are still trying to keep their natural orientation. Now, when it comes to how they see or connect with these cycles, there's a lot of different things they will use. Sometimes it's referred to as magic or witchcraft. There are differences between those two things. If you read in the Tribal Africa chapter, there's a discussion on the idea of witchcraft, which is separate from divination. And yet in other areas it will seem to liken witchcraft and divination as being the same. And of course, each of these practices is sometimes called what's known as taboo. Not something everyone's supposed to practice, or not something everyone is supposed to know about. Because of that, because of these instances of magic or divination or witchcraft or the paranormal, that which is taboo, it's also created a tension at times between indigenous or tribal groups and those who are trying to understand them, or perhaps not understand them, but mock them. Why is it that we should not wear eagle feathers and dance around with a tomahawk on Halloween?
It's culture, not a costume.
It is their culture, it is their beliefs, it is their ideas, it's what is sacred to them. We don't understand it. There's a quote, and I'm probably not going to be able to bring it up very quickly. Let me try real quick. Indigenous. If you talk to the animals, they will talk with you and you will know each other. If you do not talk to them, you will not know them. And what you do not know, you will fear. What one fears, one destroys. One other part of tribal and indigenous groups that we will work to get to on Thursday is the challenges of misappropriation, the challenges of education and understanding, and colonialism. Your textbook talks about some of the damages that come from colonialism. We'll talk briefly about the Maji Maji revolt. We'll talk about the ghost dance. We will talk a little bit about, or we will talk especially about the colonialization that happened in Australia and policies that would have children taken from their homes so that they could be westernized, modernized, receive a proper education. Needless to say, those children really go back to their ancestral homes. Usually, those children's grandchildren try to seek answers and can't find them because they've been taken away from their homes. And that idea of children being taken away, or that idea of colonialization, that idea that which we do not understand, we fear and mock, is still something that occurs to this day. And not just with indigenous religions, but it tends to be slightly higher with them. All right, so the last thing before I go ahead and start this video is a task that ideally we will get to at the beginning of class. It'll be a group activity. Tribal religions tend to be oral religions. What does that mean? To be orally based. And what form do those stories take? Are they written? No. They're oral. I tell somebody the story, they tell the next person the story, they tell the next person the story. It gets passed down. There are both benefits and problems to oral culture. There are benefits and problems to written culture. So one of the things we're going to do is talk about how oral culture could benefit the community, meaning does it help the community come closer together? Why? How could it be harmful to the community or the growth of the community? Written culture, how can that benefit the growth of the community? Or what could be a problem with the closeness of community and written culture? Alive or memory, the sense of whether or not an oral culture or written culture, what its benefits and problems are in regards to the ability to remember, but also the ability to connect with the material as it is come alive to us. We can see ourselves, understand, we can relate to the material. And then we'll talk about both benefits and problems with the concept of change, either the lack of change or the regular constant change, and how both can be problems and benefits. So since we're not going to watch the entire video here in class, let me go ahead and show you where you can find the video link. All right, if you go to Tribal Religions, which is what we are on now, it will be the first thing. It says Aboriginal video. It also tells you right here, it is a required resource. You have to get this video watched. We will start it here in a couple minutes. The importance of watching it is that it's one group that we can answer all those different types of questions of ultimate concern. Examples of your book might give us a little bit. They might tell us about the social, or they could tell us about a ritual, or they could tell us something about the ultimate. But not one group is used to describe all of those aspects. Also, the benefit we have with the Australian Aborigines is the length of time they existed without outside influence. Just as a note, on this page, you also have a few other links and some optional videos. And if you do have Netflix, there is an episode on there that talks about a gentleman who is French, and he lives as an Indigenous Native American. That's how he identifies. And he actually spent 10 years living with the group so that he would fully understand and be welcomed as one of them. When it comes to powwows, there was the one this past weekend. There is a powwow coming up on February 2nd and 3rd in Brooksville. It's a much larger one. They do demonstrations of everything from flint napping to other survival skills. In fact, the gentleman who teaches the flint napping has been featured in different documentaries. He tends to teach the survivalists how to be survivalists that then teach the average person how to survive. So really interesting and amazing people will be there. All right.